Hi, I'm Du Rosado. There it goes. I'm Du Rosado Torres, the Chief Operating Officer from Merck Human Resources.
All right, thank you both. What we are, this session this morning is focused on restructuring settings through STEP in both day and residential settings. And this is something that's been on providers' minds for the last several months. DDS released some new guidance in the summer that providers that are interested in participating in STEP don't necessarily have to have transitions included as part of their plans to be eligible, and they can participate via restructuring as well. So we hope to shed some light on that process today and to also give you all a real life example of what restructuring looks like through STEP with Melissa and Du's help. So very excited about that.
My headphones aren't working.
And before we jump in, I'm going to launch a quick poll because I want to get a sense of how far everybody that's joined us today is with STEP planning in general. So if you all can just take one moment to respond to this poll, we can get a sense of where everybody is. Awesome. I think as usual, we have a good mix of folks here. It looks like the majority of people have not started yet, and there are a few folks that are in progress, and then a couple additional people that are submitted and approved, and maybe thinking about either amending their plans, which has been something we've seen in the past, or looking for additional insight on how restructuring has looked in practice. So I will go ahead and end that poll and just show you all kind of how we break down this morning. And from there, I think we can go ahead and get started. So today, we emphasize that these sessions should be very collaborative in nature. We would love for you all to share your ideas and any questions that you have throughout the session. And there are a few tips on the screen here for you to do that. First, if you have any issues hearing, there is an easy way to enable closed captions, which I see somebody has already done. And then you can also toggle between having your video on and off with that button, and similarly with your microphone muted and unmuted. So if you'd like to jump in at any point, please feel free to raise your hand, come off mute, ask a question, or to use the chat feature to introduce your question. We'll get to it as we see it. So I would love to start with a quick round of introductions for those that feel comfortable. More than happy to have you all introduce yourselves in the chat, but if people can go around and just give quick introduction with your name and your agency's name, and also maybe what you're excited about learning today, or how far along you are with your STEP plan and restructuring in general. I think that would be awesome.
I'll start. My name is Marcy Colby. I'm from the Baraco Corporation. We have sites in Torrington, South Windham, and Ledyard. I am actually new again to the Connecticut area. I actually have been in Massachusetts DAHABs for probably about 20 years now. So I'm back in Connecticut as well. So I'm very new to this process. I know Torrington's done a little bit, but we'd really like our other two sites to get into the programs as well.
Thanks, Marcy. Excited to have you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Leilani Rivera, the Senior Director of Employment and Day Services at HARC. We are currently in the transition phase where we've been drafting what we can for employment. We did just hire a day director, so we're working together to kind of wrap things up and get more information through this seminar.
Thanks for joining us.
Hi there, Mark Perkins, Chief Operating Officer with Journey Found. We had initially floated some ideas for different projects. They didn't quite meet the definition at the time when we had the discussion. So we have pivoted to kind of just focusing on stabilization and staff recruiting, but we do have some potential ideas that we still might reapproach in the future.
Great. Yeah, excited to hear what you have.
Hello, my name is Maritza Dell from Midstate ARC, Chief Operating Officer. We have our plan approved and been working towards the progress of achieving the goals, and we're looking forward to hearing more about how to use the incentive money.
Hi, I'm Kari Ryan from STAR. I'm the Director of Employment Services, and we have an approved plan for employment, and we're working on it. And I always seem to have a lot of questions, so it helps to come on here and always pick up some tip that helps. So thank you for running these.
Of course. Happy to have you again.
Hi, I'm Erin Gasparini. I'm the Chief Program Manager for CUNE Employment Opportunities. We do have an approved plan. We're taking steps somewhat slowly in the direction of getting people independently employed. A lot of resistance from families and teams to really keep that moving forward. But so just here to kind of learn from others that have similar plans and how the step plan has worked for everybody else. So good to be here.
Hi, I'll go. I'm Leah Rogerson. I'm the interim CFO here at the ARC Eastern Connecticut. So really coming up to speed with the whole organization. My understanding is that the step incentives, the plan has been put in place or possibly even submitted. So I need to come up to speed quickly with how this whole program works. So again, thank you for putting this on.
Definitely.
My name is Yvette Horton. I am the COO of the ARC Eastern Connecticut. We do have an approved plan. We have transitioned 3 of our people from residential into independent living. So we are at the beginning of that process.
Hi, this is Trisha Gibney, ARCA Southington CEO. We have a approved plan. We have 3 ladies in a transition home, 1 currently moving into in-home supports, and with the hopes of the other 2 moving into our approved supportive housing plan. We're looking to see how these incentives work also.
Great, and we'll definitely have some time for question and answer for any questions that people have related to restructuring or otherwise with STEP. But yeah, thank you all so much for engaging today. Oh, sorry. I think somebody just came off mute, but thank you all for introducing yourselves. Really excited about the presentation this morning. And if you would like to introduce yourself in the chat later on, please feel free. But in the meantime, I will pass it over to Betsy to start talking through restructuring with STEP.
All right, thank you all. Good morning. So we're focusing today on just one of the specific categories of incentives within STEP, and it is this idea of restructuring. So once you complete this objective, then you would receive the restructuring incentive. So what are the objectives? For residential settings, restructuring means updating a residential support to serve the needs of individuals with greater behavioral or clinical needs, including individuals on the residential wait list. When you look at the day side, it could be changing a day program to now focus on employment-based services. How this is kind of recognized is really changing how you bill. So For example, is it enough to still run a DSO but offer some employment activities? You would need to have a DSO, you would need to be changing how some of that billing happens. For day, it can also mean updating a congregate or non-employment support to support new individuals with specialized or complex medical needs. This is kind of the sister objective to the residential one. And your DDS regional contacts can help you identify people with unmet day needs. And then finally on the day side, and this I think is one where people are especially interested in it, even if they aren't having a broader step plan with transitions, is ending a sub-minimum wage arrangement. So this would need to apply to all the individuals currently in the arrangement, as well as people who are going to be coming in the future into the GSE program. So then if we look at the next slide, so that's what you need to accomplish for the restructuring incentive, but what's the actual incentive? So it's a payment of $33,000 for restructuring your congregate and or non-employment day setting. Since STEP is really focused on this movement to greater independence, new opportunities for folks, the restructuring incentives are just focused on restructuring restructuring congregate or non-employment day settings. They're not, for example, for if you have a in-home supports program that you restructure to support people with greater needs. That's wonderful. We love to see that. And there's other incentives for if you're supporting people to transition into that setting. But the restructuring incentives I want to emphasize are really just for congregate settings or non-employment day settings. Now we just went through 4 different objectives, and you can receive separate incentives for each of those restructuring objectives. So that's up to $132,000. But the caveat there is if you achieve one objective twice, for example, updating accessibility and staffing in 2 different CLAs to support individuals with more complex support needs, you would still only receive the incentive of $33,000 once for the first one you restructure. Now, in some cases, $33,000 will be all you need to kind of get things rolling and moving. And in other cases, especially if you're talking about physical changes to a setting, it's not going to cover the expenses. And the restructuring dollars are not meant to cover the full cost of the potential changes, but it does provide an incentive for activities you might already be considering or that might fit well into your broader strategic plans. So for example, there's a provider with an approved plan where they had individuals who had transitioned out of CLAs, which left vacancies. And instead of just having new people move into that CLA, they first made some structural changes to be more accessible for individuals with greater medical needs. Currently, all the step plans that have been submitted that have restructuring include transitions first, and then they restructure to update that setting before new people move into the setting to fill those vacancies created by the step transitions. However, as we'll talk about next, there is the option for restructuring only plans. So if we go to the next slide. So in November, DDS put out a memo with updated information on restructuring incentives, which announces that providers may submit step plans focused on only restructuring, even if you do not plan to specifically support anyone in those settings to transition to other settings. So in introductions, both in the chat and out loud, we heard from some folks about how the plans and things that they want to do and need to do don't necessarily fit into that overarching step push for movement from congregate to non-congregate or non-employment towards employment. But it is possible that restructuring only might be a good option for your provider agency, depending on what you're trying to do. So DDS has finalized and posted on the provider gateway, which you can see in the screenshot here, a simplified step transformation template that is for providers submitting plans that are on restructuring only. There's a separate one for day and for residential. You still use the same budget template, but we'll get into it later, but you don't have to fill out the whole thing. So the information requirements for these plans on just the restructuring pieces is a little more in depth than the transition focused plans, because it's an opportunity for you to communicate back and forth with DDS about what the really transformative nature of the changes you're making are. And restructuring only plans are, of course, eligible for the restructuring incentive, as well as the scope incentive. So the scope incentive is about how many programs are involved. So for example, if you were restructuring 3 different programs, you'd be eligible for $17,500. If you're restructuring just one, it's $7,500. And then additionally, you would receive the restructuring incentive for each objective you completed. So we'll go ahead and pull the slides down, and we just went through a whole lot there. And we're excited for our presentation from our CR. But before we do that, I wanted to see if anybody had any questions on what we've covered so far.
So for, this is Trisha Gibney, for the 33,000 per individual that transitions into to this, I guess, the supportive housing or IHS or for residential purposes, that does not come to the agency until that person shows that they're successful in that?
Great, so that's a separate incentive, the incentive for individuals transitioning. The transition incentives are for somebody moving from a congregate to a non-congregate or non-employment to employment. And there are incentives connected to that. We can share like a 1-pager that goes through the different incentives. And that is $33,500 on the residential side and $15,000 on the day side. And yes, that transition has to happen. The person needs to be in the new setting for 60 calendar days. For the restructuring incentive, the 33,000 for, let's say you have taken a DSO and are modifying it to bring in some nursing staff to support, or some behavioral trained staff to support people with greater behavioral and medical needs. In that case, it would be once people have started coming into the setting, and with DDS, you all have demonstrated that this is sort of a permanent transition, that we really have transformed. It isn't just, oh, we took like 2 people in and then we're gonna sort of stop that later. But yes, so the objective has to be complete before they'll pay. That's part of why the scope incentive is important. Once your plan is approved, then you receive the $7,500 for sort of the scope of one program. And as you continue to complete, then you receive additional funding. Other questions?
So if we have a program with high medical needs, that's not going to be considered a segregated setting?
It would need to still fit the requirements of a CLA or a DSO for being sort of community-based service, but it would not be considered especially segregated just because you're supporting people with greater needs. Now you could still also, that setting can still support people who don't have greater needs. So let's say, for example, you have a CLA that 4 people live in, and maybe 2 people are transitioning out, but 2 people are staying. And those 2 people might not have greater behavioral, well, they wouldn't right there because you're restructuring. So if you're restructuring to then be able to support greater behavioral and medical needs, and 2 people move in who those are the support needs they need, the CLA as a whole is still supporting people with a range of needs. It doesn't have to be only people with the greater needs.
Yeah, I was referring more towards the DSO programming.
And similarly with DSO, you would still be able to support people with a range of needs, but the idea is that folks who currently may not be able to find DSO supports that meet their needs, whether for medical or behavioral reasons, to then be able to come into a DSO and find those supports. but it would, the setting would still support people with a range of needs, potentially. All right. Well, we'll have an opportunity for additional questions as we go through, but I'm now really excited to turn it over to Melissa and Du.
Hello. So, I think there you are. So I'll share my screen. Okay, can everybody see that?
Looks good.
Okay, so our plan is, what we're going to talk about today is solely based on our day program. So we have a DSO and an employment program here in Middletown. And so when we looked at STEP, that's what we really looked at to restructure. So I'll kind of scroll through if you want to talk about how we looked at it.
Sure. So we were planning already on restructuring prior to STEP. We were looking at it as an organization. What are some things that we could do to be more operationally efficient and eliminate some redundancies? Because we did find areas where there was too many hands in the pot, if you will, where things weren't getting done because there was confusion. And we met with the STEP team and went over what we were planning anyways, and it aligned with STEP. So that our original restructuring plan just aligned with STEP. So we put in for the STEP plan. We've been able to get incentives since. So like I mentioned, we looked at operations. We did a task analysis per position in the department. So essentially we sat in rooms with a big whiteboard, and folks, would brainstorm weekly, monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, all the various tasks that they needed to do. And the goal with that was hopefully to align positions with tasks that made sense with them. We also reviewed and updated the staffing patterns per program. And we did that by reviewing the individuals in each program and trying to group them in a way that made sense. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple of slides. And then we identified individuals that potentially could be in employment programs. We had a handful of individuals in our DSO program that we felt had the skills necessary to become competitively employed. And we took that idea, and some of the obstacles that we faced were teams really liked, and individuals really liked some of the activities in DSO, so they were kind of reluctant to go into in a strictly employment-based program. So we created the idea and structured a program called the Vocational Development Program. Move to the next slide. So for operational efficiencies, we met with each position individually and in groups. And we had several meetings. It took approximately, I would say, a month or two to kind of have through all these meetings. And again, we brainstorm our different tasks that they do and put them onto a whiteboard. We didn't group them by position. We just wanted to essentially just put things on a whiteboard, and later on we analyzed and grouped things by task, by positions, what made sense. And then we took a look at our organizational structure and started brainstorming some ideas regarding those tasks and how that could possibly change some of the positions that we have. We looked at the staffing patterns and individual groupings. So this is a big piece for us. By looking at the staffing pattern we had in place, we noticed that it wasn't really efficient, and it wasn't grouping folks in a way that made sense. And it wasn't allowing us to take in new individuals because, as we all know, small group, large group, and one-to-ones, if you don't do that properly, you're going to end up with staffing patterns that are not necessarily efficient or allow us to be able to grow. Part of that, too, is looking at how individuals are grouped. We looked at their interests, their needs, and their ratios, and then we redid our staffing patterns to be more consistent across all programs. So essentially, we ended up with about 5 different staffing patterns based upon our needs that included transportation, outings during the program, and which programs needed how many staff. Previous to that, we did have folks that were in essentially blended, but there would be a couple days in DSO, whether that be 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, and a couple days in GSE. And that by itself kind of created staffing pattern issues within each program, because then there'd be days where the individuals would drop and a program would be overstaffed or understaffed. And that led to the idea of the vocational development program. So after we kind of looked at all this and decided a staffing pattern to make sense, we started to meet with the teams and discuss the new program structures and ideas for folks that we identified for the change. So our vocational development program was probably the highlight of this change here. So it's essentially a blended program of DSH and GSH with their 3 to 2 day ratio. So for example, they would ever, 3 days of DSO and 2 days of GSE, or vice versa, based upon what their goals and needs are. But both the programming in both areas focuses on gaining life skills to increase independence and therefore increase success in employment and gaining meaningful employment. So it's really driven by, for the DSH programming part, is social skills, managing emotions, developing relationships, life skills to increase independence, opportunity, but still having opportunities to participate in those fun programs, because that is some of the concerns we got from the teams. What about Dance for Stacy or all these different other things that we do? Can they still participate in that? Otherwise, they really weren't interested in moving over. So we were still able to incorporate that into the programming, so they still had an opportunity to have these fun activities, but still be able to gain some skills. And that's a typo on my part. The second part here is there should be GSH programming concentrates on. So job skills, how to search for jobs, resume building, interview skills, managing work relationships, and then participating in volunteer and internship sites. We also had occasionally be able to send them to paid sites to see how they would do there. So based upon the day and what we had available, they occasionally will go to one of our paid sites and be able to earn some wages. And we also do skill and interest reviews. So that's pretty consistent. We do that pretty consistent with them to make sure that we review the skills they're learning and to see if they have any other areas of interest. As far as implementation, so we implemented the staffing patterns and individual groupings. So we regrouped individuals based upon need and skills, like I mentioned. So essentially, folks with intensive staffing, behavioral needs were grouped into a DSO program. Folks have more medical needs into another, and then folks that are more recreational based folks into another group. And then we implementing the staffing patterns from there. So we met with each staff over a course of a month. And after we met with all the staff, we implemented the new staffing patterns 30 days after that to allow the staff to kind of have time to adjust their schedules. We completed the IDT meetings for all the individuals moving the programs. And again, that date for that START program aligned when our staffing pattern started. And then we began the new structure 30 days after. The next part was the implementing the new organizational structure. So we were already working on this, like I mentioned before. So we realigned our directors, and Melissa will get into this a little more detailed, for different departments. We had case coordinators, which previously we called case managers, that were assigned directly to a program. We looked at that structure. It wasn't really efficient. The caseloads were really skewed depending on the program. So we retrained them and redid their program caseloads based upon numbers and need of individuals versus just a program. And then we started new responsibilities and tasks for each position on that date as well. So we met with all our team members here, the directors, managers, case coordinators, and so on, so that everybody has a clear understanding of what their new responsibilities would be. So for example, previously we had assistant managers on second shift in residential. That really wasn't working too well for the responsibilities they had. We went away from that and kept the managers in each residential home, but now the case coordinators are helping them with the IPRs and documentation check and doing audits, so that our managers could concentrate on the day-to-day operations as well as the medical oversight and medical appointments. That for us made better sense based upon our task analysis. And then we're continually reviewing and adjusting over time. So we're doing internal quality reviews to see if there's areas of need. We're creating training curriculums for all levels, including managers and directors, so they have a very clear understanding of their roles. And we're still having monthly meetings to review the current structure for any adjustments that need to happen.
So I'll talk a little bit more about the structure that Du started talking about. So this is our current structure that we have now in our agency. So when we were looking at the STEP plan, we initially were told, well, you're already doing it. You really should just put it on paper and get incentives for it. Because we were taking a holistic look at our agency. We were looking at residential, IHS, and our day and employment services. And so what we decided to do was, from top down, really take a look at our structure, make sure it was efficient, make sure we were consistent throughout the agency. And so we separated our IHS and our CLAs, made it into two different directors so that our IHS director could really concentrate on cluster, which is a new initiative for us as well. We combined our day and vocational services. So now we have one director over all of our day, all of our employment, and then created a director of quality improvement. And that person supervises our case coordinators, so that now that is throughout our entire agency, creates efficiency, creates consistency and transparency. It's now a totally separate department versus being within each one of the other within one of the other departments. It really created a much more efficient structure for us versus what it had been before. And so that's really what we were aiming to get by doing all of this. we're starting to see big changes here. It's actually been really phenomenal in the agency, just with morale, culture. There's a lot more cohesiveness and people working together because they're being forced to now. And so that's been really interesting for us to see. It hasn't been all puppies and rainbows. It definitely was a learning curve for us, and Betsy knows that. You know, we did struggle in the beginning with understanding how to actually write this, how to wrap our minds around it in DDS language, so that, you know, we knew our plan was what DDS was looking for. We just had to figure out how to translate that, and then understanding how the incentive worked and how we actually got paid for that. So that was a big learning curve for us, and we're still trying to figure it out. You know, which one times we have to write, when we write them. So that's still ongoing for us. But that's essentially our presentation.
Thank you both so much. We have some time set aside now for y'all to ask any questions that you have. I know that was a lot of information, so please, floor is yours. And you can feel free to just come off mute, or you can use the chat as well, and we can address that way.
Well, and to Melissa's point about sometimes we have to navigate and sort things through with STEP, that's because this is new for everyone, right? It's new for providers, it's new for DDS. And after I was presenting on the restructuring incentive, Owen had sort of patted me on the side. He said, Betsy, are you sure that you can't restructure a non-congregate setting like IHS or ISE? And so I went back and looked at the documents that define it with the federal government, where DDS got approvals, and there actually isn't any clarification one way or the other on that. So if you are trying to restructure an ISE or IHS to support people with greater behavioral and medical needs, it does look like that is in fact an option. We just haven't seen any plans like that yet. But even as we were talking about providing more guidance about restructuring, something DDS continues to emphasize is this importance of they want people to feel free to be creative and to push for new ideas. And so the guidelines really are like, if you're thinking about something, talk with us, see if we can figure out how it might fit into STEP, like Melissa and Du were saying, because there might be opportunities to receive some additional funding or support.
Hi, I have a question for Melissa and Du. Hi, guys. So we have what we call an explorative day program that kind of mimics what Du talked about with the mixed programming with DSH and GSH. So my question is, because I've been trying to write this plan up and figure this out, in terms of their program services, did you place a timeline on how long they would continue to mix programming, or was there a timeline to get to the GSH component, you know, into employment, or did it just remain the same within that program? If that makes any sense.
What do you mean? That they would like graduate, like transition has a timeline?
Like transition out. So the pushback that I'm getting back from families, because in our explorative day program, if there are individuals that have the mixture of DSH and GSH, and we're saying, okay, we're going to do this mixture in the hopes that in the future, they could go into our employment program and then into integrated employment, families are like, no, we kind of like this mixture and we want it to remain the same. So is the goal typically, and I think this is where I'm getting confused, is the goal to get them out of that mix, or, you know, did you put into the plan that they're going to stay that way? So that's kind of where we're stuck for this program in particular.
Yeah.
So for us, the timeline is based upon the individual. So there's no 1-2 years, or, you know, it's obviously reviewed at the 6-month and annual as far as their progress. But we will be able to offer more employment opportunities for contracts as we grow our contracts. So versus, you know, if folks does really good in the GSA portion, for those days, they may go to some of our contracts as we continue to build that. But we did get the same pushback from families as far as they really like the DSO and the activity component. And so we decided not to have a timeline in there. It really be individual based. If an individual and their team feels like they're ready to move on to be full-time GSE or ISE, whatever it may be, we would make that happen for them. But at the same time, if they felt comfortable with the current program they have and they felt like that was adequate for them, that they had the option to stay there as long as they wanted.
Okay. All right.
I think Leilani, and I think for us, we were doing the same thing. We were overthinking it. Like,
Yes.
I think that was a big thing for us is we were like totally overthinking it when it really just put it on paper. Like just put it on paper what works for your agency and works for your folks.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I do want folks to know too, we're not done in the restructuring process. We're still continually analyzing it, looking at different positions and tasks and trying to figure out different ways to grow and concentrate. For example, now we're really looking at our IHS and residential, and the restructuring that we did affected all departments. So it set us up to start looking at cluster and growing our independent living services. So that wasn't part of our plan, but it was part of our plan. It wasn't part of our STEP plan. So it just happened to be that our restructuring plans fit really nicely with STEP. We're going to be looking at the residential portion ourselves very soon to see if there's a plan in place for that, because we already have done the legwork as far as restructuring, so it makes better sense. So like Melissa mentioned, don't overthink it. If you already have a plan for restructuring, you're looking at your task and looking at what operationally efficient, what changes you need to make, start there first, and then meet with Betsy and Owen, and they'll kind of guide you through as far as what pieces fit with the STEP plan and how to get incentives for that.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Any other questions for them? Okay. Well, they keep talking about getting it on paper, right? What works for your agency, what works for your folks. So Owen's going to walk us through what that paper is, what it might look like.
Yes, and thankfully it's not a blank page. We have a couple of templates here that are structured to help you all get your thoughts in order in a really streamlined way. So I'm going to share my screen. So I know that some of you have already submitted transition plans, and many of you have attended TA sessions where we have talked through these templates in the past. And there are a couple of places where you can capture restructuring as it pertains to your STEP plan. The first of which is in the traditional transition plan templates for both residential and day supports. There is a section 8, which is at the very bottom of everything. It comes after the narrative summary of the plan that focuses specifically on restructuring. It's pretty brief relative to the rest of the plan because all of the other information about the settings and about stakeholder input is captured up front. So all you need to do in section 8, if you are filling out a transformation plan that involves transitions, is to note the number and type of settings that are involved in the restructuring, what your agency's plan is to identify individuals to move into the setting. And as you'll see, there are a couple of options here in terms of working directly with DDS or pulling people off the wait list. And then a very brief timeline question about when move-in will happen, essentially when will restructuring be complete, and then a high-level overview of what the restructuring plan looks like, what are the components of it. And this is really to help reviewers get a sense of the scope of the plan as they're going through and making approvals and asking questions and working with you all to adjust as needed. So we highly recommend that you complete the narrative portion. It just makes everybody's lives easier. So that's the restructuring component of a transition plan. And then what was very recently released by DDS are these restructuring only templates. So if your plan does not involve transitions, this is where you want to be. And there is a separate template for residential restructuring and a separate template for day and employment restructuring. So a lot of this information will look familiar. It's much of what is captured in the transition plan template, but it is a little bit more expansive than just that brief section 8 because it hasn't captured the rest of the information. So there's the typical demographic piece, and then the detailed information about the setting in question that's being restructured. which is all very straightforward. And then section 2 here gets into the details of the restructuring plan itself. So we're looking for a description of the supports being restructured, what the staffing plan is in terms of if staff are coming on, if there's additional training required as part of the restructuring, anything like that. Same question here about how you plan to identify individuals to move into the setting. And then question 4 is a little bit different. It has to do with the impact on people that are already in a setting and plan to stay there once restructuring is complete. And because of the restructuring template, this would primarily be relevant in a CLA setting where maybe one of the rooms is being restructured or the entire setting is being restructured, and there might be some staffing differences for the people that remain in the setting. And then likewise here, we have a high-level narrative summary of the overall restructuring plan to help the reviewers. And in addition, we have a more detailed restructuring timeline. So ideally, you'll be able to report on key milestones throughout the process of planning the restructuring, not just when that anticipated end date is, to help reviewers see what the process is, kind of what investments you're making, and what some of your sub-steps are going to be in the restructuring process. And the last piece here is asking about how you incorporated stakeholder input into the development of this plan and also into how your restructuring plans in general were informed. And so any work that you've done here to engage individuals and their families directly, any work that you've done coordinating with case managers, all of that should be included in this section. So none of this is earth-shattering if you're familiar with the STEP templates. It's very similar to what you see in the transition plan templates with a couple of distinctions. And the day and employment restructuring only template is very similar with a few distinctions, obviously, for the current support types. And then there will be nuances in how a day setting is managed relative to a CLA post-restructuring and kind of what the impact is on the folks that are still in that setting. But yeah, this is very similar to the restructuring template for residential transformations. And yeah, much of this you'll be familiar with. And this is essentially the narrative portion of your plan. So whether you have transitions, you would complete section 8 in the transition plan template, or you would complete the residential restructuring or day, unless you're planning to restructure both, which in some cases I know providers are planning to do both. Any questions about these specifically? I'll also show you briefly how to manage the budget portion of this application. And I see a request from Maritza to share the restructuring template. We can send the link in the chat. They have been posted to the provider gateway, actually, so you can grab them from there. I'll be sure we do that before the session ends. And if there are no questions about the narrative portion of these, I will talk briefly about the budget. I know many of you have heard me talk about this in the past, but the budget for STEP is less complicated with the restructuring plan because you don't have to do the individual by individual line items for each transition. So what we would expect to be filled out in the budget for a restructuring only plan is this summary sheet. And specifically the piece where you indicate which of the restructuring objectives your plan is addressing. And this will essentially allow the reviewer to cross-reference your budget with the narrative portion and validate it that way. So if you say you're completing objectives 1 and 3, they'll double check the narrative of your plan to make sure that makes sense given what you presented there. So you'll indicate which restructuring incentive or which objective your plan completes, and then also the number of programs that are being transformed as part of your plan. This is the scope incentive that Betsy talked about, which is worth up to $17,500 if your plan transforms 3 or more programs. All of this is just yes or no inputs for you, and then the incentive totals will be calculated automatically, so you don't have to worry about any of the math there or adding it up. And then the last thing that we wanted to say about this template, it's having some technical issues switching between the tabs here, so give me 1 second. I'm going to stop sharing and try to figure this out. But this is something we've also talked about in the past, where there are what we call transition program costs associated with your restructuring effort and your transformation overall. And those can be captured in the very last tab over here. So if there are costs that you're incurring outside of your normal processes to make this restructuring possible, you would capture them on this tab. And like Betsy mentioned, also the incentive associated with restructuring is not intended to cover your expenses, which is why it makes a lot of sense to show the scale of your plan, the other costs that you're incurring, particularly if you want to request additional one-time dollars from DDS, which you can do in this tab. And if you fill out the transition program costs, it will allow the reviewer to see a comparison between the incentives that you're potentially being allocated and what your actual costs are, and help them make a determination about whether it makes sense to award additional one-time funds. So there is not as much information for you all to fill out in the budget as there would be with a transition plan. But this is still a really critical part of the review process that reviewers will need to verify between the narrative and the budget as they're making approval decisions. Any questions here? I know the budget has been a sticky subject in the past, so happy to answer anything. Okay. Betsy, it looks like she just linked the provider gateway where you all can find all of these resources and then additional frequently asked questions, helpful incentive guides for the rest of the step incentives to understand the scope of the whole program. But at this point, would love to open the floor in general. If any of you all have specific questions about the plans that you're considering or thinking about submitting, or if you have general step questions, we'll make some time for that now. And Betsy also just linked our technical assistance email in the chat. So if you would prefer to have a conversation one-on-one with us where we can really look through the details of your plan, we are more than happy to do that. And while we're waiting for any questions, I will go ahead and launch a closing poll just to get a sense of who we have on the call and if you all are thinking about submitting restructuring only plans or plans with transitions. So if you could just take 1 minute and fill that out, that would be super helpful for us. And if you already have a plan submitted and approved, there's no need to fill out the poll.
Any questions or thoughts or comments from folks on the line?
So I guess I'm just curious, Will Hardy from Hark Incorporated, Day Services. So one of the things we're trying to bring back is an OTPT component. This particular agency in this facility has significant ability to provide really strong OTPT aspects as well as massage. 3 things we did actually in the past. So I've been on the phone with local OT and PT providers. I'm just curious if other agencies are exploring this, and if so, how are they going about possibly incorporating this from a more medically enhanced model? I think these components are very important, especially if you can provide these services, because a lot of organizations don't have the facility to do it, but we do. So back in the COVID days, we had these things in place. We're trying to jumpstart these back into motion. But I'm just wondering if other agencies are doing it, and if so, what steps are they taking to try to make it an easy process to acquire or reacquire?
Great, thanks, Will. Is anyone on the call exploring something like what HARC is looking at? As you said, it's not everyone can do it, right? Uniquely qualified with you all. But we haven't seen it in any of the other submitted plans, not specifically, but it is certainly an interesting opportunity and piece.
So one of the things I'm finding is that I may be able to get providers to do it. It becomes a billing situation, whereas if we can get providers to come in and do it and contract, they would bill for their services when they're in the building, and then of course we would not bill for that individual. So if somebody's attending for a 6-hour day program and they have an hour or 45-minute appointment for OTPT, we would obviously only be able to bill for the time that they are directly with us. So we have a minimization of attendance, but a maximization of a positive service.
And potentially a maximization of people who would be seeking supports from your agency and interested in participating in your program.
Agree. So we might be the only ones doing it. Okay.
We often
Good to
see
know.
once one agency does, then
Of course.
then folks follow on. So look forward to seeing it. All right. Owen, do you want to share the poll results? We do have some non-providers on the call today as well. And that's a great reminder for folks that you can partner with other providers in your plans. You can partner with other entities, like people who provide remote supports or who work in monitoring and assistive technology. Use your networks. Talk to folks. There's a plan that includes setting up some, like a council of local businesses to create more opportunities for conversations about employment. So it isn't something you have to do alone. We're here to support the development of your plan. DDS, your regional contacts, especially the resource administrators, are going to work with you on aligning the plan to the needs they're seeing in your region and to what works for you all. And then, of course, working with other local partners in your area, whether other providers or other partners who you've had success with before, or like Will just laid out, OT and PT providers even. Right. Well, we'd like to thank Melissa and Du again for their really helpful presentation. We just always love hearing directly from the providers, and we know that other providers do as well. And we'd like to thank everyone for taking time out of their morning this morning to come and join us for this session. The next session will be on benefits counseling, brushing up on benefits. We will have somebody from the Bureau of Rehabilitative Services talking about what benefits counseling is and how providers can support people to access it. We know that that's going to be really important for a lot of providers who are supporting individuals to move into greater employment or more competitive wages. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.